Good morning, everyone. My name is David Blankenhorn. I'm the president of the Institute for American Values, and I want to welcome each of you for the release of this, we think, important study called The Taxpayer Cost of Divorce and Unwed Childbearing. I want to introduce Ben Scafferty here, who was the principal investigator for the report, Randy Hicks of the Georgia Family Council, who was one of the co-sponsoring organizations, as is Maggie Gallagher of the Institute for Marriage and Public Policy, and Jeff Kemp of Families Northwest. You'll be hearing from each of them in a moment. If you were a marriage advocate in the year 2008, there are basically three arguments you can make. First, you can make an argument based on religious faith. You can say that our currently high rates of divorce and unwed childbearing are in conflict with biblical values and pose a challenge and threat to our religious commitment and our religious faith. And indeed, many people from the faith community in recent years have been vigorously making exactly this argument. The second thing you can do is make an argument based on social costs. You can point to the human suffering involved, particularly when it comes to children. And indeed, in recent years, using the tools of the social sciences, many marriage advocates have been making exactly this case. And I think it's some of them in this room. I'm looking at some of you. And this has had an impact, I think a positive impact on the debate, by getting some very important information out there. The third and final way you can be a marriage advocate in the year 2008 is to make an argument based on economics. You can say that leaving aside the issue of ethics and religious faith for a moment, and leaving aside the issue of the human suffering involved, in addition, there is a dollars and cents cost to the very high rates of divorce and unwed childbearing that we as a society are currently experiencing. But the problem is that marriage advocates up until today have been fairly tongue-tied when it comes to this third argument. Why? Because we haven't had good evidence. We've had speculation, we've had good guesses, we've used our common sense, we've said, oh, this must be costing a lot of money. But we haven't really had rigorous study producing hard data until today. And that's why we're here. Now, if you were a marriage advocate in the year 2008 who is tongue-tied on this third dimension, this economic dimension, there are two groups that you're going to have trouble with. In particular, you're going to have trouble when you're talking to business leaders. For understandable reasons, they are used to hearing things expressed in concrete dollars and cents terms. And secondly, you're going to have trouble with policymakers because they are the custodians, principally, of our tax dollars, and they like hearing things expressed in concrete dollars and cents terms, especially as regards the public costs, because this is what they're responsible for. So, it should come as no surprise that a couple of years ago, it was a business leader who had been in conversations with policymakers on the issue of marriage, who came to several of us and said, the guy, Chuck Stetson, a businessman from New York City, who's here today, it was his idea. He came to me and he said, this has got to stop. We have to be able to have this third leg of the argument. It's probably not even the most important leg of the argument, but it's an important leg, and we need to do this. And here's a grant, and just go solve this problem. Yes, Chuck, we'll do that. I said, well, gee, we can't do it. It's a big project. It'll cost too much money. We have to start small. We'll pick one state. So I called my friend Randy Hicks from the Georgia Family Council, one of the great state organizations working on this issue. I said, Randy, do you know a good state we could do a study in? He said, well, you know, Georgia's a pretty good state. So we found Ben Scafferty from Georgia College, who had the expertise and was willing to invest the serious amount of time and effort to do a careful study, bring in all the best scholars as advisors, and off we went. We're about 6 months into the study one day, and we're talking on the phone, and Ben says, well, gee, I've got to get I'll take the national data, and then I'll break that down for Georgia. And Randy and I kind of did an uptick. I said, Randy, we're a couple of slow Southerners, but did I just hear Ben say that we have the possibility not for one study, but for 51? Did I just hear that? Because if you could take national numbers and break it down for one state, if that's how the model works, you could take national numbers and break it down for all 50 states. So all of a sudden, we went from one state to a national study. We got, in about that time, joining our team was Maggie Gallagher, who has played her usual brilliant behind-the-scenes role as an organizer, as an editor, as a shaper of every dimension of the project, and also Jeff Kemp of Families Northwest, who is doing, along with Randy, I think just the pioneering work of bipartisan, broadly based, inclusive, marriage-strengthening programs involving all sectors of the society. He and Randy and Julie Baumgartner, a couple of others of you who are here, and some of you who are not here, are really paving the way on this. So we had this little team, and we did the study. So that's where the study came from. We're real proud of it. We think it's pretty solid work, and we think that it'll give us that third leg of the argument. The main reason I care about strengthening marriage is because I care about children, and I care about the suffering they experience when their parents aren't there to care for them and to love them. That's the main reason I care about it. But I also feel it's important to realize as well that that this does have an important dollars and cents dimension that can be quantified, and that it is important, especially when we talk to business leaders and policymakers, to be able to speak that language. So I think we're less tongue-tied after today. And that's be good for America and good for the cause that a lot of us are working toward. So with that, I want to turn this over to the man who did the work and I think deserves a lot of credit, and is going to walk us through briefly some of the findings of the report, Ben Scafferty.
Thank you, David. I do want to correct one thing that David Blankenhorn said. When Randy and David first called me, I wasn't willing to put this many hours into the project. It just turned out to be longer than I thought. I'm not so magnanimous. You're going to hear from some very articulate people today that are used to talking in public. Now you're going to hear from the nerd. I'm an economist. I deal with numbers. They usually don't let me talk in front of people. I actually did put on my one suit. I did brush my teeth. That is very uncommon for economists. If you happen to know any, you probably don't. And that's by design. As David said, the title of the report is The Taxpayer Cost of Divorce and Unwed Childbearing. And when they called me, Randy knew me very well from Georgia, but David didn't know me at all. And, he's very, wanted to know if I was any good. And, I said, I study public finance, I study education policy, urban policy. And David said, how big do you think the number is? I said, I have no idea, but it's not zero. And so I guess that was good enough for David. So I did it in a way where I wanted to make sure I had an underestimate of the taxpayer costs. Because, I've been in academia most of my adult life, but I did spend some time working for 2 governors in Georgia. And, these interest groups pop studies in your face, and usually my eyes would roll, and I could take, a back of a napkin and show how their results are ridiculous. I didn't want to be that person. I'd never been part of the marriage movement. I hadn't really thought about it, to be honest. I studied public finance, labor economics, so I thought about it a little bit, but not seriously until this project. So first I want to show you that I think this is worth thinking about. And we all know this is true, but I just want to show you the actual numbers. In 1970, about 85% of American children lived with both their parents. Basically a generation later, that had fallen to 68%. That's a huge social change in a very short period of time. The good news is that it seems like it's not getting worse. It seems like that the percent of children living in two-parent families actually had a very slight uptick between 1998 and 2005. The bad news is that it seems to be at a much lower level than it was, again, not that long ago. Why do we think marriage may improve economic situations of adults and children? Because if marriage does improve the economic situations of adults and children, that means that there'll be less need for government-funded transfer programs, for example. First is economies of scale. And what that means really is savings from size, And that is that if two adults are married, then there are two potential incomes for which to finance the family expenses. And also, they can share expenses. For example, they can live in one residence instead of two. The second reason why you think marriage might improve economic situations is marriage might change people's behaviors and habits in a way that makes family life more stable or more productive. What you'll see in a minute is that the report, to generate my estimates in the report, assumes that the second one does not exist. So to generate my estimates, I assume that marriage doesn't improve your habits or your mores or your behaviors. And I'll talk about more in a second. Marriage is equals economies of scale. Lots of economists have generated these examples. I just borrowed this one. It's in the report. If you have a female high school dropout, and she's a single mother living with two children, and she earns a typical income for female high school dropouts, she and her two children will live in poverty and be eligible for food stamps, for example. However, if she were instead married to a male high school dropout who was earning a typical income for male high school dropouts, and they lived together, they would not be in poverty and they would be ineligible for food stamps. So this is just a simple arithmetic problem, right? You put two relatively uneducated folks together earning typical incomes for high school dropouts, living together, they're not in poverty and they're not eligible, for example, for food stamps, right? This is the mechanism I'm using in the report to generate the estimate of the taxpayer cost of divorce and unwed childbearing. It's that we have good estimates from lots of economists and sociologists as well that marriage reduces poverty rates. And we have good estimates about how poverty affects use of government programs and things like crime. So again, I want to obtain a lower bound or an underestimate of the taxpayer cost of divorce and unwed childbearing. There are really four key assumptions in the report that suggest that I am underestimating these costs. Right? First is that, I already said this, is that the only effect of marriage on the use of government programs comes from the effect of marriage on poverty. That is, I'm assuming that marriage has no direct effect on the use of transfer programs or things like crime rates. We have pretty good evidence that that assumption is not true, but again, it has the effect of meaning that my number is an underestimate of the true taxpayer costs. Second is that the assumption used to generate the results is that marriage would lift 0 single-father households out of poverty. I was forced to assume that because researchers really don't look at single-father households, probably because almost 80% of single-parent households are single-mother households. I mean, we should look at single-father households, but typically we don't. So I was forced to assume that, and surely if some single-father households were to become married households, some of them at least would be lifted out of poverty and out of eligibility for government transfer programs. So again, this assumption also suggests that I'm underestimating the taxpayer costs of family fragmentation. Third assumption, marriage would lift 60% of female-headed households out of poverty. The estimates that people have generated on this topic typically range between 65 and 80 or so percent. That if female-headed households were to become married households, between 65 and 80% of those households would be lifted out of poverty. My view, based on reading these studies, is that the 65% number is the best estimate of this. I wanted to go a little below that, again, in the interest of being cautious. Last assumption is that the share of expenditures on government anti-poverty and justice programs that we can attribute to divorce and unwed childbearing is equal to the percent of poverty that results from divorce and unwed childbearing. I talk about this at length in the report, and the reason that's a reasonable assumption is because we have very solid evidence over many decades that single-parent households with the same income as married households are much more likely to actually access government transfer programs. In many cases, 1.5 to 3 times more likely to use government transfer programs if you're a single-parent household than if you're a married household. So given the same income, single-parent households are more likely to actually use these programs. But I'm assuming, to generate my estimate, that they're not. Taken together, and with these 4 assumptions and other assumptions used to generate the results, again suggest that we are underestimating these taxpayer costs. Some of that, what I just said, was complicated, and if you read more in the report, it is complicated to non-economists and non-sociologists. But I just want to give you some context for these estimates, again, to see if they pass the smell test. Right? First, the methodology I used suggests that not quite 32% of housing assistance expenditures that are spent in this country are due to family fragmentation. But I read the Atlanta paper, and then I called to get the hard number. Almost everybody that gets housing assistance from the Atlanta Housing Authority is in a single-parent household. But my estimate only suggests that slightly less than 1/3 of that is attributed to family fragmentation. Second example I want to give you. 56.4% of local jail inmates, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, did not live primarily with 2 parents when they were growing up. And according to the Georgia State Supreme Court, slightly over 1/3 of the cases filed in Georgia State Superior Court are what they call domestic relations cases. This is divorce, alimony disputes, child custody, adoption, etc. So it seems like the justice system, police, courts, and jails, a sizable fraction of folks that are involved in that are from fragmented families. However, the estimates I used to generate my taxpayer costs to the justice system only suggest that 8.7% of these costs are due to family fragmentation. Now, I presented my results to various audiences, mostly academics, but sometimes there was policy types. When I showed slides like this, the policy types would jump up and down and say, we know it's higher than 8.7%. I would agree. But again, I used the most cautious empirical estimates I could find in the academic literature to make my estimates. That said, I don't think it's as big as 56%. Just because 56% of the folks in jail grew up in fragmented families, we cannot say that 56% of taxpayer costs of jails would go away if instead they had grown up in married families. We just can't say that. So I assume the truth lies somewhere between 8.7% and 56. We can disagree about whether it's closer to 8.7 or 56, but I'm very confident that it's greater than 8.7%. That's just if I couldn't remember what domestic relations cases were. Right? So what is my estimate of the taxpayer cost of family fragmentation? Right? I break it out by different government programs that I considered, and the grand total is $112 billion in annual recurring taxpayer costs of family fragmentation. So this is a combination of federal, state, and local taxpayer costs. So what that means is, over a decade, taxpayers spend over $1 trillion in costs that I can attribute to family fragmentation, and again, I think that's an underestimate. And here's an itemized breakdown of those costs. The 2 biggest items you can see are Medicaid $27.9 billion, and those numbers are in billions. The reason the Medicaid number is so big is because Medicaid's a very expensive transfer program in the United States. The second biggest cost is to the justice system, $19.3 billion. The other costs I considered were TANF, which is welfare, cash assistance, food stamps, housing assistance, S-CHIP is State Children's Health Insurance Program, child welfare programs, WIC, Women's, Infants, and Children, energy assistance, Head Start, school lunch and breakfast programs, and the last three are additional taxes paid. There's very good evidence about if you grow up in poverty when you're a child, that you earn less later on when you're an adult. So I took that literature and I combined it with a literature on how much marriage affects poverty, combined those numbers to generate these estimates about how much additional taxes paid would children pay when they were adults if instead they had grown up in a married household instead of a female-headed household. And again, the grand total is $112 billion. Okay, there are two important taxpayer costs and there's many taxpayer costs I didn't consider, but there are two that I would call large. First is the Earned Income Tax Credit. This is a $40 billion transfer programs to working class Americans. It's a very complicated program in the way it's administered. It's also very complicated in the way it interacts with other transfer programs. Because of those complications, I didn't feel comfortable making an estimate of the taxpayer costs of family fragmentation for the Earned Income Tax Credit. I do it in the report, and it's about $12 billion, but I didn't include that in my main estimate. Second is public education. Next school year, in K-12 public education, we'll spend about $500 billion on K-12 public education. Other than school lunch and breakfast programs, I'm assuming that family fragmentation doesn't affect the public school system. If you ask any teacher in America, they'll laugh if you tell that to them. The two big examples that I can think of are special needs programs and remedial programs. Students that are classified as special needs or in remedial programs, state funding formulas for K-12 education typically provide more money for those students, as does the federal government in many cases. But I'm assuming no cost there. However, there are estimates of how growing up in a single-parent family affects your probability of being in one of those two categories. But because of the way costs are not calculated very carefully in public education, I didn't feel comfortable making estimates. But again, I would bet a lot of money that cost isn't zero. Let me conclude by saying, so what? It's $112 billion as the taxpayer cost of divorce and unwed childbearing. I'm an economist and I'm a public economist, so, and I deal with public policy issues. I think that number is meaningful, it's significant. So I think it's worth thinking carefully about what government and civil society can do to promote a culture of marriage. Because if we could promote a culture of marriage, as David mentioned before, I think the biggest benefits to that would be to the people involved. If we had more of a culture of marriage in this country, the biggest beneficiaries would be the adults and children affected by divorce and unwed childbearing. However, my results also suggest that taxpayers are affected in a significant way by divorce and unwed childbearing. So I think government and civil society should think carefully about what we can do together to improve the situation and promote a culture of marriage. And I'm willing to take questions at the end on methodology or anything else.
Thank you so much, Ben. Before we open it up for questions, I want to ask Randy Hicks from the Georgia Family Council, partner in this project from day one, to say a word or two.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Ben. Thank you for your great work, Ben. You may be a nerd, but you're a smart one. And we appreciate your great and hard work on this. As David pointed out a few minutes ago, a couple decades worth of scholarly research has demonstrated a clear link between family fragmentation and significant social harms. We know that unwed childbearing and divorce is causing a lot of suffering. In simple terms, we know that people, particularly children, are more likely to suffer various harms when parents part ways or fail to marry. This report gives us something new and something that has long been needed. It has given us the most precise estimates to date of the taxpayer cost of divorce and unwed childbearing at all levels of government. So as David mentioned earlier, what was once an educated hunch is now confirmed. Family fragmentation is costing Americans a lot of money. Now, for most of us, $112 billion is a pretty difficult number to get our minds around. We don't deal with sums that large. So by way of comparison, I hope to put it in perspective. Last month, it was reported that the 5-year cost of the war in Iraq had reached roughly $500 billion. During that same 5-year time frame, government spending resulting from divorce and unwed childbearing was roughly, according to Ben's cautious estimates, $560 billion. So during the very same 5-year time frame, government spending resulting from divorce and unwed childbearing exceeded spending on the war by roughly $60 billion. That's a huge sum. So what does it all mean? Some of these things have been alluded to earlier, but over the past 20 years or so, family fragmentation has been viewed largely as a moral or a social concern. The sheer magnitude of these numbers suggests that reducing the high cost of unwed childbearing and divorce is also a legitimate concern of government leaders as well as community reformers and communities of faith. The report also reveals that even modestly successful efforts to reduce divorce and unwed childbearing would save taxpayers a lot of money. For example, a 1% reduction in unmarried childbearing rates would save taxpayers $1.1 billion. A specific example comes from the state of Texas, where lawmakers recently appropriated $15 million over 2 years for marriage education and other programs to increase the rates of stably married families. If that program succeeds in increasing those rates of stably married families by just 0.3%, Texas taxpayers will save $9 million per year. That's pretty big savings for even just a modest success. It's worth noting a couple of important and intentional omissions in this report. First, the report makes no recommendations. Secondly, the report does not make any judgments about any existing or proposed policies or programs. We all have ideas and thoughts about what we should do, but the report is silent on those matters because it's about the cost. That's what we needed, and so that's what we have. And we're also very aware of the fact that Americans from all across the country are going to have widely varying opinions about how much and in what ways government ought to be involved in this issue. But we also believe that a rigorous discussion is demanded on government's role in strengthening and promoting marriage. The taxpayer costs are just too large for us to ignore. We also believe that it's important to point out something that I hope is obvious and something that was mentioned by both Ben and David, and that is that while the report draws attention to numbers, we are very aware of the fact that these numbers represent real people and real suffering. So while the costs render this a legitimate government concern, ultimately the reason why we're involved in this is because we know that people are suffering because families are breaking down. That's what drives us into this issue, and that's what keeps us moving forward on this issue. If we didn't save $1, it wouldn't matter as much to us if we were saving people from suffering. That's what this is about. We're not suggesting there's an easy fix for issues as challenging and as complex as this. There never is. And we're also not suggesting that government possesses the silver bullet. It does not. But the fact that it's challenging, the fact that government does not possess the silver bullet for solving these problems, does not mean that we should surrender to the trends. Historically, Americans have resisted the impulse to surrender to negative trends, particularly when they are the source of so much human suffering. We have fought problems like poverty and racism and domestic violence and drunk driving, just to name a few, because we understood that the stakes were high. And when we understand the stakes are high, citizens of goodwill from all walks of American life come together to do something to bring about positive change and to improve the conditions in which we all live. The stakes are high when it comes to marriage and family. That's what this is ultimately about. We believe that we can do more to not only reduce the human costs, but also, as Ben's pointed out today, we can have an impact also on the government cost. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Randy, and thank you also to you personally and your team at the Georgia Family Council for your leadership in this project, really shaping it and creating it and seeing it to fruition. Done a great job, and really, really grateful to you. Let's open this up for questions. Sheila, how do we want to do this? Okay, so you're going to play the kind of Oprah Winfrey, hold the mic, and we'll go to questions.
And also, if you see someone, David, that you particularly want me to pass the microphone to, would you point that out?
Okay.
Hi, I'm Jim Zimmerad with Dads and Moms of Michigan. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the tremendous work. I'm a numbers guy, and I know in the state of Michigan we have 10,000 employees administering TANF and some of the other social welfare programs, and we have 1/2 of one person focusing on father issues, having the father involved in the family. Does your report include all of those state and federal employees administering all of these programs?
In terms of food stamps, I was able to break out administrative costs, and I did not include those in the report, and again, in the interest of being cautious. In some of the other programs, they would have been included because I couldn't break that out. So that's...
I'm Ron Grignell. Your report did a lot, about poverty and low income, but it seems like if you wanted to attack the costs, say in the middle class, you'd have to look at something slightly different, maybe not taxpayer dollars, but something like economic growth, where families can't create as much wealth if they're divorced, less money for investment. Married families have more children. When they get in the workforce, they're more productive, on and on and on. And just the fact that there are more children.
I want to let any of the panelists speak on this, but it's really interesting that you should raise this question. We were talking with Chuck Stetson, whose idea this study was, and he pointed out that in a certain way, this is really the beginning of a 3-part investigation of the economic consequences of divorce and unwed childbearing, because you would want to look at the cost to businesses, right? You want to look at if employees are suffering from this problem, what does it cost business? And you would also want to look at, I think what your question points to, which is the general drag on economic growth and prosperity for the society as a whole. Not just isolating this one dimension of government costs, but what does it cost us as a society in terms of prosperity to have such historically unprecedentedly high rates of family breakdown. Now, this is a future agenda for us. And we hope, with some participation by some people in this room, to address this in the future. This was the first leg of the third leg. You know, you got religious faith, you have social costs, and then you have economics. And within the economics, this is the first of what we hope will be several further investigations that will pinpoint exactly what you're pointing to.
David, can I make a quick comment on economics? It's interesting, from the Greek roots of the word economics are ekonomos, which is the study of the affairs of the family. And our economy, entrepreneurship, the wealth of our nation is significantly affected by how well we manage human capital. And a mom and a dad, a marriage institution is the most pro-child. And really, we're finding, although we haven't done the full research yet on impact on business and the whole economy, really one of the most entrepreneurial, enriching institutions in our nation. And as we do more research in these various areas, I think our eyes will be opened and the national discussion will lead to a national movement. And it's based in compassion, but it matches up with economics.
Hi, I'm Nick Zill. I've been looking at the effects of divorce and unmarried childbearing on children for about the last 30 years. And while I agree with the thesis, basically, that you're arguing about, I want to point out some ways in which you may be overestimating the effects of marriage and divorce. First of all, low IQ and family transmission of antisocial behavior tendencies. Both of these are associated with things like high school dropout, unmarried childbearing, other things. So to the extent that you're not taking an effect of differences in IQ, differences in antisocial behavior tendencies, you may be overestimating the effect. Secondly, you're ignoring the social and monetary cost of unstable, high-conflict marriages, in which a lot of low-income marriages tend to be. We know, that, for example, that one of the perhaps beneficial effects of more single-parent families is smaller welfare families. We have fewer children now than we did, and there's certainly, every police department can tell you what the cost of having to have multiple visits to a high abuse, kind of high conflict family. And those don't enter into your equations right now. Finally, the estimate you gave of the number of children living in two-parent families is actually an overestimate. Well, about 10% fewer live in two-parent biological families, About 10% of kids live in step-families. And our evidence is that children in step-families have negative effects, even though they're in a two-parent family, and are better off financially. Some of the effects of that marital disruption don't go away just because you change the economics. So again, I think your basic thesis is correct, but I want to point out these little aspects that you might want to take into consideration.
Thank you, Nick. Nick Zill has been a leading researcher on this field for many years. And Ben, do you want to?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
The studies I relied on did take into account IQ and antisocial behavior. And I did, again, pick the most cautious studies that factored into those issues. I agree with you about high conflict marriages. The thought experiment in the report is that all single mother households would get married, but obviously I'm not advocating that. I'm not suggesting you marry the lout down the street. And third, the issue with step families and things, there's good evidence about crime that if you're especially a young male, adolescent male, living with a step family or what have you, that you still do have higher probabilities of committing crime, for example. But I think your points are well taken.
I just want to
Nick,
add can I just add too that if you want to wade into the actual report, Ben is rather carefully, in addition, he presented here the reasons why he thinks this is an underestimate, which is his bottom line. But there is a careful section where he takes account of the arguments for why this might be an overestimate and explains, why he dealt with them in that way.
And Nick, your second point seemed to imply that less marriage meant less domestic violence. There's no evidence for that, is there? So if you drive down marriage rates, you're not doing any favors to people who care about domestic violence.
Actually, there is some evidence in the crime victimization data that abuse within married families has declined over the years. So, I mean, I take your point very well that there's a lot of abuse that's associated with multiple partners and that, and I don't mean to underestimate that, but I still think that we need to look at least to try to make some estimate of, what would the effects be of some of these not such ideal marriages.
I see. Okay, good.
I'm Mike McManus. I'm president of Marriage Savers, and I'm a newspaper columnist. I write a column called Ethics and Religion. First of all, I want to compliment you on the work that you've done, because there really has not been this kind of data available. And we at Marriage Savers have actually created a new website taking advantage of your data to try to generate a movement to reform divorce law, no-fault divorce law. And we call the site reformdivorce.org, for those of you who'd like to see it. We build your data into our website. But I am puzzled that you omitted certain elements that seems to me ought to be a part of your total cost. For example, the earned income tax credit is mainly a cost of poverty. Why wouldn't you include that? Secondly, we know that the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, now called No Child Left Behind, there's a clear federal cost for that. It's right there in the federal budget. Why didn't you include that? And the Justice Department costs, the cost of prisons, I'm stunned that you would use a figure of 8% of all the cost of the justice in this instead of something like 30, 40, 50%. I don't understand why it's so low in those three areas. But it's nevertheless an important new report. It just seems to me your figures are probably more like $185 billion, not 112.
Ben needs to answer that, but let me just say a couple of things. The first, and I don't know, you might have missed this in the way Ben presented it, but this report assumes that all of the taxpayer costs of marriage are driven by, or of non-marriage, are driven by the increases in poverty that result. And this is, again, a very cautious assumption, because we know that two parents working together to supervise children probably have better educational outcomes, less juvenile delinquency, et cetera. But, so why didn't we try to estimate them? There's one good answer, Mike, is that that Ben did not feel, as a professional economist, that he could quantify these in a way that took into account Nicholas Zill's concerns about, some of these marriages are not good and are not going to produce the same outcomes that the average or the typical marriage does. So in the interest of coming up with a figure that we felt would be, we could say with great confidence, this is at least what family fragmentation costs taxpayers each and every year. We made a number of not only cautious but simplifying assumptions. The EITC program Ben was about to tell you is extremely complex, and you have to make assumptions about what happens to income after people marry, for which there is not a good empirical basis. So we know there are impacts there. We didn't feel we could with confidence quantify those impacts with the same degree of confidence that we can have in these figures. So at every point where we met somewhere where you could say reasonably, we know this cost is not zero, but we couldn't tell you with confidence what that cost is. That tended to get excluded from the report, including, I would say, add the biggest single government cost that's not in this report, in my opinion, and was deliberately excluded, is the cost to Medicaid and Medicare of more and more older adults entering late middle age and old age unmarried. We know that there are higher rates of disability, that people end up hospitalized more, their hospital stays are longer. These are real costs that the government is incurring because men and women aren't achieving their own life dream, by the way, of having a stable, loving marriage partnership. But we couldn't quantify them with confidence. And so whenever we hit that roadblock, the answer was, we're not going to just pick a number and make up the figures. If the academic literature wasn't there to justify the hard number, we put it to the side.
Yeah. Also, one of the ground rules of the study from the beginning was Ben said, I will not write an advocacy report. I won't do it. I won't do something that's going to make advocates happy. And we said, we agree, that's what we want. We don't want the typical advocacy report. We want serious scholarly work that's going to be bulletproof here and going to be able to withstand the most careful scrutiny possible. So he consistently went for conservative estimates. But I guess you might want to say something, Ben.
Yeah, I agree with what they said, and I guess I have to say, I think like the previous questioner prior to you, Mr. McManus, that, academics, we're a skeptical group. Math professors debate whether 2 + 2 = 4, seriously. If I couldn't feel extremely confident that something was an underestimate, I didn't include it. And, I only used the most careful studies, but I'm not disagreeing with you. I think the costs are bigger.
Okay, Mike, the amount that's due to family breakup is, in fact, this came up specifically during the vetting process. If you talk to economists, Mike, and not to journalists, you will find that there was not confidence that you could estimate it because the ITC is complicated. It depends on which person in the marriage earns what amount of money. And so you've got to match people up, and then you have to assume what are they going to earn after they're married. And it's complicated, Mike. It's not simple.
And that affects their TANF payments, et cetera?
And I want to say, the other thing I want to add, you'll see some of the project advisors here. These are only a handful of the academics, more than 20 serious scholars were involved in helping us to vet this report, and we not only used Ben's native caution and brilliance, but his reaction to the academic debate within the scholarly community to drive the decision making.
Hi, Ben. You are at the beginning of your presentation. You showed. I'm Dave Ferdoser from National Review. At the beginning of your presentation, you showed a comparison of the number of children living in intact families, 1970 versus today, or versus, 2003. You're assuming in this study that every single woman in poverty with a child gets married.
That's the thought experiment, yes.
Under that thought experiment, the government would save $112 billion. Is there a way to compare the costs relative to the comparatively stable familial situation of, say, 1970, sort of as a more realistic way of looking at what is the cost to us now compared to that?
Yes, I could have calculated it that way. One group of scholars that wrote a report that I relied on, their estimate of going back, they didn't get a taxpayer cost, but going back to 1970 would have saved roughly, let me do the math in my head, about 2/3 of my estimate.
Going back to the family formation rates of 1970.
Yes, is what they estimated. But again, they didn't look at taxpayer costs per se.
So we're not saying that, we don't imagine that every person is going to marry. We don't imagine that that would be good. We're not advocating that, but the only way you get a baseline for our calculations is to do it this way. So yes, you could go to 1980 and you would get goodness gracious, you could, a 1% improvement in our basic marriage rates, 1% would cash out at over $1 billion of savings.
Thank you for doing this study. My name is Janine McKenzie from Denver, and I'm with the National Campaign to Strengthen Marriage and Families. But the thing that I wanted to share with you, and in regard to the question what Mike raised, is we do a lot of research with the CDC. We have some grants from the CDC, and they are very careful with us to teach us the difference between correlational studies and causal studies. And I think that's what you're doing, is that correlational stuff, because some people, some groups just traditionally don't marry. But then we have to bode the question, why is that? Why is it that some people traditionally don't marry? And we're dealing mostly with teenagers. And one of the things that we teach teenagers is the fact that, that years ago there was no research about what made relationships work. And there was no research. Now there is. So it would be sinister not to give this research to the kids, because we have a whole generation of young people that are cynical about marriage, and they have every right to be. So I think that that's part of the national dialogue. And I thank you for being so cautious, because even if you say it's not an advocacy piece, there will be some people that will call it an advocacy piece. Doesn't matter what you do.
Can I say one thing? I mean, I did use only studies that tried to look at it in a causal fashion. And I use, again, the most cautious ones of those.
Hi, David Levy, Children's Rights Council. Our work is mainly to assure that children of divorce and never marrieds have two parents in their lives, because someone must help these children families while America rediscovers the value of marriage. So we compliment you highly on trying to rediscover the value of marriage. We're also working with Marriage Savers, Mike McManus, to try to supplement what you are doing. If you succeed more, if this marriage movement succeeds more, our Children's Rights Council can disappear and we can go whale watching.
That's our mission here.
Can't pull it this far.
Good morning. Cheryl Wetstein with the Washington Times. I have kind of a so what question for you, which is that Europe and Scandinavia are kind of further down this road with low marriage rates and high rates of unwed childbearing, and even I think their divorce rate is pretty decent. So even if they eventually get married, they don't necessarily stay married. And I wondered, those economies seem to be in some good health. So my question is, if Europe and Scandinavia can sustain these kind of alternative families, why can't the United States? Why can't we just continue on this way?
That's a great question. Let's let a couple, yeah, Ben.
I'll just say, you know, Europe, while their economy's done well in the last couple of years, their per capita income is significantly lower than the United States, and their tax rates are much higher.
Yeah, I don't think that the measure of a significant social problem has to be that a society cannot exist unless we solve it. I mean, there are many societies that have existed with slavery and racism, too. That doesn't make them good things. So that would be my first response to this. The so what of this report, to me, is that doing nothing about our current high rates of divorce and unmarried childbearing is very costly. It's very costly to our children, both as young children who have to figure out why the two people who made them can't seem to get along and raise them in one family, and how much that hurts. And some of them, at least, will be damaged for life. Not, thankfully, the majority of them, but some of them. It's very costly to our young adult generation who retains, and this is perhaps the most significant thing here in America, the next generation longs for marriage. They long for stable, lasting love. I don't know if you've seen the Newsweek story on the divorce generation. It tries to end on an optimistic note, but you can't read those stories of what those kids go to without, you know, your heart breaking. So it's costly to communities that have to deal with the problems that result when men and women, for whatever reason, aren't able to make and sustain healthy marriages in which to raise their children. And it costs the taxpayers a whole lot of money. And so what do Americans do when we define a problem, a real problem in our society? We're not a people who just, you know, throw up our hands and say, oh, well, there's nothing we can do. It's a trend line on a graph. You know, we roll up our sleeves, we work together, we figure out some ideas, we try some stuff. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. But over time, we figure out how to do things better in order to prevent this kind of suffering and inequality and damage to children. And the message, I think, probably the most practical message from this report is that even very modest reductions, it's kind of hard for a lot of us to imagine going back to the 50s or even whether we want to. But it's not that hard to imagine that next year the out-of-wedlock birth rate could be 37% instead of 38%. And if we did that, if we could find a way to succeed that, to help more people who marry make successful marriages, not only would there be some real live children who would be saved a whole lot of suffering, but in addition, we would save the taxpayers a pile of money. That's a real win-win. And the answers are not going to come from government, but I do believe that public policy plays a role. The government is deeply involved in the family lives of all these communities. And if we talk to young men and women, poor young men and women, about their contraceptive use and their job market and their education, and we never ever bring up the M word, that's not neutrality. That's sending a message that marriage doesn't matter. We know that that's not true. So the bottom line is that we need to tell the truth to the next generation and find ways to work together to build a little bit better, healthier, stronger marriage culture in this country, for me.
We're going to take one more question, and then we're going to wrap up. Sheila, you had the lady here, I think, has been raising her hand.
It's okay. As I was saying, I'm not a numbers kind of gal, but I am a clinical psychologist, and I think it's important to bring attention to the human suffering that I see in the treatment room. And I've been a clinical psychologist since the early 1990s. And there are things that cannot be measured. The intrapsychic conflicts that children suffer. And I think it's important. When I read all the studies, something that's really missing, that I find missing, is that the intrapsychic conflicts that children struggle with are not something that is easily measurable. And what I think that's most important is that we see when the family breaks down, that children lose a very important piece, and this is the model, a model of human relatedness. The children see how a mother and father interact, how they show affection, how they resolve conflicts. And when this model breaks down, and the children don't see this on a day-to-day basis, they lose a very important piece to internalize, in which they can draw upon, and I call it their library reference, to take with them and carry with them for the rest of their lives. So we miss this very important piece when we don't have parents together. And I think this is important to bring attention to the psychological aspect of the human suffering.
I really appreciate that people like you are on the front lines of dealing with the aftermath, and the people who suffer are very vivid because you help them with their suffering, or try to. I just want to say that people who've worked with the Institute for American Values have been some of the best people for calling attention to this kind of suffering, beginning with Judith Wallerstein, and more recently, the really groundbreaking work of Elizabeth Marquardt on what divorce does to the identity of children of divorce, and herself being a child of divorce knows this firsthand. So I appreciate that not only you, I think most people who get involved in this marriage work really are not like, they're not like Ben. But we really appreciate the Bens of the world. And even the economists, I suspect, as Ben told you, are deeply moved by the desire to not only to minimize the suffering, but also to offer new hope. Human beings want love, and they want to believe that love can last, whether they're children or adults. And that's really what a lasting marriage culture is about.
Good. It's a beautiful way to bring this to a close. I want to, starting with Jeff Kemp, I want to ask the panelists to have a final word. And Jeff, what are your thoughts as we close?
Well, the question that really brings this home is the so what question. Why do we care, and what can we do? And as you were just mentioning, the woman who was just speaking, there are millions of tragedies playing out every single day, and have been, of course, throughout history, but particularly over the last 40 years in this nation. Children are living in tragedies. Couples are facing tragedy. Single moms, single dads, grandparents having to raise kids they didn't expect to have to raise with far less ability and natural support than parents. And yet, compounding these tragedies, what a tragedy would be if we knew solutions existed, and yet we didn't bring attention to them. We didn't market them with the energy and the passion that we market hamburgers and clothing and automobiles in this nation. And if we have solutions, which we do, a 29% drop in the divorce rate in Hamilton County, Tennessee, where the community and the government and the churches and the businesses have come together to say there are skills that can be taught to couples to help them reach their dream and protect their children. There are skills that can be taught to dads to actually invest and change these kids' lives. If the solutions are existing and yet unknown, we need to get the marketing effort out there. And this research says there's a high price, let's pay attention. I look forward to the business research that shows the business community how much it's costing them when families break down and marriages are under strain and moms have to leave work because their kid is struggling because their family's going through something. When that research is as well done, as well as this thing that costs every taxpayer of America and our government, then I hope that we will fully marshal this nation's great resources to say, let's put human relationships back front and center at the national agenda. Marriage is the most diverse institution in society. Getting a man and a woman together, that ought to be a message for our nation that wants to bring together the divides. And yet if we can't put this together, we won't heal our other problems and we won't take care of kids. So that's the so what. That's why it matters so much. That's why we're very thankful for the hard work that Ben's done and all the people in this room who care about this and who are doing work to address it.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say to Ben that when my son was 16, he came home with a joke, which was, what do you call a nerd in 15 years? And the answer was boss. But now it's principal investigator.
I really don't have much to add. I think I'd just be echoing everything that has been said so far. One of the things I do want to say is thank you to Chuck Stetson again for having the idea. Thank you, David Blankenhorn, and your remarkable team for all your great hard work. And this has been a great project. It's an important project. And the thing we have to fight is cynicism, that nothing can be done or that it doesn't matter. Something can be done. There are examples of it, and we ought to be doing it. So thank you.
I just want to thank everyone up here for giving me this opportunity and for all their support. I just want to say, promoting a culture of marriage in terms of taxpayers, there's a lot of juice in that orange.
Thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it. I'm sure the panelists will be available afterwards to answer further questions. But thank you so much for giving us your time. Help yourself to more coffee if you want on the way out, and see you next time.